All right. Well, we turn now to our main speaker, Dr. Andy Root. Many of you are very familiar with his work already. I remember as a youth pastor relying heavily on the material that he was putting out at the time, and then when teaching youth ministry, signing his books, just a lot of value in what he's written, gifts to the church. Dr. Andy Root is the Carrie Olson Balson Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He writes and does research in the areas of theology, ministry, culture, and younger generations. There's a number of works you can see listed on the bio, all the books that he's written lately. And I hope that when you checked in, you're able to pick up your free book as a part of your registration here today. If you haven't, you want to make sure and connect with Kelly in the back to do so. I just want to mention that we had Dr. Root come out and share with us in June with a program called the Ministerial Coaching Initiative that we have going out of the CPL. And the feedback was so overwhelmingly positive and affirmative, and we received specific feedback that said, you need to have Dr. Root come back so that we can invite a larger audience to benefit on what he has to share. So we did just that. We had to entice him with an offer of fish tacos, but something we're easily able to do. So will you join me in welcoming Dr. Root this morning?
All right, so I'm not gonna sing a song, but it always feels like that when I grab this mic. So thanks. This is the first speaking engagement I've ever done that there's been a rain delay. So I feel like, I don't know. It feels pretty cool. All right, so I have one big question for us to ponder together, and it's a why question. And this why question, I think, is existential for a lot of us sitting here, but here it is. Why does it just feel so hard right now to be a pastor? Why does this moment, it just feel so hard? So let me just start by answering it right off the bat. And the reason I think it feels so hard to be a pastor right now is because of the secular. That's the answer. Well, thank you all. I hope your commute home is okay in the rain. Tip your waiter on the way out. All right, so we're gonna spend the day trying to unfold this word because this is a very complicated word to get a handle on. I do think the answer for us is the secular, but what the secular is can be incredibly confusing, and the ways it gets its tentacles into us may be quite confusing in their own right. So that's what we're gonna do for the day. But to get into this, your caffeine's rushing to your system. You're sitting with some people that you want to talk to. We're going to start in a little odd way, which is I'm going to play a video for you. It's about a 4-minute video, and get you talking together a little bit. So this comes from the PBS NewsHour. So I am revealing that I am a PBS nerd. I watch too much PBS, and I am a supporter. So I have my little tote bag in my bag, so I am a supporter. But this comes from the PBS NewsHour, and it was at the end of the show, they'll do these little cultural pieces, and there was a book published, and they are interviewing the author, and this is the title of the book. It's by a woman named Wendy Russell, and the book is Relax, It's Just God. How to talk to your kids about religion or God, you'll see the title, when you don't believe in it. So what I want you to do is watch this 4-minute interview. And I just want you to have a disposition, not of judgment or affirmation. I don't want you to be like, oh, I hate her, or she's got it. Just be an anthropologist here, just for 4 minutes, and lean into what she's saying, and why is she saying what she's saying, and what interests you, what jumps out to you. So about 4 minutes, then I'm going to have you turn to some people next to you and discuss it, maybe for 5-6 minutes. I think it's always important to tell people in groups how long it will be, because introverts like to pretend they get phone calls when it becomes group time, that they just have to call home. And shockingly and magically, the phone call always lasts just as long as a small group time. I say that as a severe introvert, so I know how that goes. So I'll have you talk in groups for about 5-7 minutes, and then we'll talk together a little bit. I think this will frame our day a little bit. So here's the interview.
Generously sprinkled with what many view as teachable moments, perhaps none as challenging as those surrounding faith and religion. Author, journalist, and NewsHour online parenting columnist Wendy Thomas Russell comes at this from a different angle in her new book, Relax, It's Just God. How and why to talk to your kids about religion when You're Not Religious. She recently talked with Jeffrey Brown and explained how the book came to be.
I was in the car and my daughter announced to me that God had made her and that God had in fact made all children and all people. And
you thought...
And I was so... she was so incredulous because she just thought, this seems like really big news. And how you don't know it, Mommy, is really beyond me. But it struck me. I mean, I was really caught off guard by it. And
what did you say to her?
I didn't say much at the time. I sort of stumbled through the conversation. Oh, who is God? And I sort of stumbled through the conversation, and then later went home and talked to my husband, and he said, it's not what Maxine believes, but what she does in life that matters. And it was a turning point for me, this idea that if we raise kids to be moral and ethical and kind and generous, then what they believe is secondary. And it's been a guiding force through the book.
I want to ask you about the title. For so many people, God and their religion are a basic component of who they are. It's not just God.
Right.
And yet you use that, just God, relax. It's
right.
Just God.
Right.
What do you mean?
I don't mean to be flippant or insensitive in any way, but it does seem like there are certain topics that are hard for parents to talk about and to broach with their children. And increasingly, religion is becoming one of them. And in a lot of secular families, the word God is almost replacing sex as a kind of this taboo subject. So
the hard discussion that parents might have.
Yes. What I was getting at was that if it's not such a difficult subject if you approach it in the right way. And so we can all sort of lighten up.
You're coming at this as a secular, non-religious parent.
Correct.
You see a growing need for this kind of discussion.
Religion isn't going anywhere. Religion is going to be around for a very long time. But it's true that secularism is on the rise, and it's growing rapidly, and it's grown in the last 20 years. The problem with a lot of parents in this particular group is that they are trying to raise their kids in this era of transition or this era of change. So let's come up with a way that we can talk to our kids about religion that's completely honest, that values critical thinking, that values religious tolerance and literacy, and that kind of leaves the door for kids to really make up their own minds.
Give me an example of a common dilemma that parents find when it comes to raising their children vis-a-vis religion.
There are quite a few, and I did a survey of 1,000 non-religious parents to find out exactly that. And the top reason cited was people weren't sure how to talk about religion without indoctrinating their kids into what they believed themselves. That was a hard line. The other one was interacting with religious family members and keeping the peace in families. When you're raising a child who is in a secular household, how do you bridge the gap between the older generations who may be more rigidly religious?
This word indoctrinating is an important one because it comes up time and again here. What's the difference between indoctrinating and guiding children, right?
Indoctrination I see as almost the antithesis of critical thinking. Of course, it's fine to guide your children, but I see indoctrination as sort of this middle ground between, full-on brainwashing and guidance. It's stronger than just merely guidance. I see indoctrination as telling children that there's only one way to believe, and that all other ways and people who believe all other things are less worthy of our respect, less intelligent, less moral. That's the crucial issue, because I think that when you do that, you set up your child to be bigoted against those who don't believe the way that you do. It's not a black and white world.
Well, so give me the example of the most basic question of your child says, "Mommy, does God exist? And what is God, or who is God?"
The way that I go about it is to say, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're thinking about it. That there are a lot of different ways that people describe God and describe what God is, and this is what some people believe, and this is what other people believe, and I don't believe in God, but that's okay. It's all okay, and you get to make up your own mind about what to believe.
Isn't that kind of mushy? Isn't it the job of a parent to guide? I'll use the word guide again. their child to say, well, no, it's not just this, it could be this, it could be that, whatever you think, whatever goes.
Right. Well, I think within reason, and I see a difference between guiding your child to be a moral person, an ethical person, a self-respecting person, a critical thinker. Those are all really important things. Guiding them to believe in a certain way, in a certain God or a certain prophet, that is not so important. I really want to focus on what people do in life and not what they believe, because if we can judge people on their actions and not what we think the reasons behind their actions are, it makes for a more tolerant world and a better world.
All right, the book is Relax, It's Just God. Wendy Thomas Russell, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, so turn to some people next to you. What do you make of this? What jumps out? All right, let's come back together. So, just being very curious people, not making any necessarily evaluative judgments on whether you love what Wendy said or hated what Wendy said. If we're just curious anthropologists, what's interesting about what she says? Yeah. Yeah, what did you hear that you found fascinating or just your mind grabbed a hold of? Oh, go ahead. Let's go here and then we'll go in the back. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. She really deeply believes that what you believe and what you do can be separated, that they are not connected realities. Now, let's just be very respectful people. This is a very bright woman, very well-educated woman, probably, I mean, we don't know, but I would guess a very good mom, very attentive mom. But she does have this very clear idea that beliefs and actions can be separated. And my guess is most people watching that interview probably never even questioned that. That just seems logical. If you go down to the taco place down the street when it opens, and most people would assume that, yeah, that's, of course, you can do that. Who cares what you believe? It's what you do. Very interesting that these can be separated. I want to circle back to that. In the back, yeah.
I thought it was interesting that she said you can teach morals and ethics, but where do the morals and ethics come from?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yes, there is a deep assumption, again, that she is definitely trying to frame her daughter's life. She's trying to shape it morally. She wants her to be a good person, a person who hears what others have to say, that treats people with respect. But there's not any real direct connection to where that comes from. There is a deep sense of a kind of traditionlessness to this, that it doesn't come from somewhere. It's just obvious, right? And there's no sense of where that obviousness comes from. Really great thought. Yeah.
Just noting that she seemed to speak about religion and not being connected to that, but there really wasn't much talk about either faith or spirituality.
Sure, right. That's a really fascinating point too. My guess is if she was in this room right now, and we were able to interview her, she would say, oh, of course I want my daughter to be a spiritual person. Or if we said to her, we watched your interview, and, we're different in this room because we're really spiritual, and you're not spiritual. She'd probably stop you and be offended and say, no. I'm a very spiritual person, but I'm not a religious person. I don't want anything to do with religion. And that's very interesting too. It connects with this other dichotomy that seems to be held together, that it's not what you believe, it's what you do. Everyone can be spiritual, but religion, not only do you not need it to be spiritual, but it could hamper your spirituality. That's a very interesting kind of imagination that people had. Yeah, I think that's really well said. Yeah.
She talked about guiding your children, but not brainwashing.
Yeah.
And how do you differentiate that line? I mean, and it comes back to our values.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to teach my children what I believe is the value that I want them to have, and yes, I will wash their brain in the sense of right or wrong.
Sure.
It's not,
Yeah.
that's a hot stove, so
Yeah.
touch it if you want to, but
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
So there was
Right.
a non-committal to
Yeah.
making sure she didn't brainwash inappropriately,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. So,
Yeah, it actually is quite fascinating as Jeffrey Brown, the interviewer, is talking with her. You kind of get this sense, or maybe I'm reading into it, but you get the sense that he's not buying it. Yeah, he's kind of like, so what's the difference between, and she is, you can see, I mean, this goes back to the comment in the back of the room, like, you see she has a deep moral commitment here. Brainwashing is bad. But then when asked to differentiate how one forms one's child, which she clearly wants to do, where's the line there? What is that? And she has a really, I mean, I think a lot of people would have a hard time negotiating what that is. So that's a really interesting moment too. We want everyone to be free thinkers, and everyone to have the freedom to think for themselves, to claim what they want. We're going to get to this later in the day, how important this is. But no one can kind of, the truth of the matter is everyone needs to live inside of some way of being formed. Like, as human beings, no one gets to live in some hermetically sealed space that isn't impacted by certain ideas and practices and perspectives and a tradition and a history. And she's not really sure how to negotiate that.
and
Yeah.
when we make the statement, as for me and my house, we will
Yeah.
serve the Lord. That is a personal declaration or a stand.
Yeah.
I'm going to lead in
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, it is fascinating that she, and again, we'll be able to tease this out as we go, that she's really committed that her daughter is completely free as an individual to make her own choice. But also she wants, God bless her, to be a good parent who's guiding. And so negotiating the kind of hyper-individualism with the necessity of connection, passing on of some framework, there's a certain chafing that happens within that. I think it's also quite common in our cultural perspective. Yeah, please.
I'm a chaplain in Scripps, and increasingly when asked the spirituality of their religion, people say exactly that. I'm spiritual but not religious. It's very curious what's going on.
Yeah.
That's not a majority statement.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want you to hold that too, because I think as we're going to see, as we try to unfold this word, the secular, we are living in a very strange kind of secular time, because it's a kind of secular time that is not devoid of spirituality. It creates a hyper form of spirituality. But that doesn't mean it's not secular. As we're going to see, this secular space creates the possibility for all sorts of individuals to have their own kind of self-created spirituality, and there leads to a kind of need to be spiritual in some way. So it's a very weird time we live in that way. Maybe one more comment, and then I'll start telling you this story of particularly how we could get to a world where beliefs and actions could be so easily separated. One more comment? Yeah, please.
We were talking about how we respect how she wants to give her
Yeah.
the opportunity to explore. However, especially we feel like there's like an end point of that, because towards adolescent age, they desire answers and they desire this guidance. And if they're not going to give it as a parent, they're going to go
Sure.
somewhere else and try to get it. So I feel like even her thesis can only last so long.
Yeah, and it is really fascinating how, did she say how old her daughter is? I mean, you get the sense she's probably, what did she say? Yeah, it sounded like kind of anywhere from 6 to 8-ish kind of. There's also a prophetic move in here. She starts this whole thing saying, in the car, my daughter says, starts talking about God, and Mommy, did you know God made us? And she even says, my daughter was incredulous. The fact that I didn't know this. It's really pretty fascinating also. I mean, this is not where we're necessarily going today, but there is this sense even of how children become kind of prophetic of pointing us to this. And she really would like not to think about this at all. I mean, it seems very just, you live, actions, beliefs. We don't need to worry about beliefs. Let's worry about actions. But now she has to, because her daughter says, Mommy, did you know God made you? Oh gosh, what do I do with that? I mean, she basically says, like, I didn't want to have the sex talk this early, but then she brought it up, so I had to have the sex talk. I mean, she equates it with that, saying God is like talking. It's the topic you shouldn't want to talk about, So maybe she was thinking, well, we'll have to wait until she's in middle school and she's got some friends who want her to go to church or something to talk about this. I'd like not to talk about it for the next 10 years, but bang, here it is. That's pretty fascinating, and you can kind of get echoes of Jesus in the Matthean text, putting the child amongst them and say, if you want to enter the kingdom of God, become like one of these. All right, so how do we get to this world? Why is being a pastor so hard? Why can we live in a world where people can easily say, we looked at a lot of different dichotomies there, but I do think a really profound one is that you could separate actions and belief. How does that happen? So let me tell you this story of how we get there. Again, trying to unfold what we really mean by the secular. Because the truth of the matter is, we're not going to do this, but I could pass out note cards right now and ask you all to write your definition of the secular on that note card. Then we could take a break, and a few of us could read all of those, and we could start to kind of organize them, and we could get a big newsprint on the wall, and we could put everyone's definition, and then we could look for overlap. And the truth of the matter is that I think there would be overlap, that a lot of us think we understand what the secular is. But the more we looked into it, we would start to see divergence. The secular is a very slippery word. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with someone and they say, the issue with our denomination is we're just dealing so much with the secular here in Southern California, or here in the rural communities or something like that. And then you start talking about it, and then you start to realize, well, I don't know if I think that. There becomes slippage on what we actually mean by the secular. And I think it's very important for us to get our arms around it, because there are parts of this that if we aren't really clear of what's going on, we may take certain actions that could make things worse. And I'll point that out as we go here. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to go on a journey with me. I asked for the time machine to be here so we could all go back in time together, but I was told because of the rain, the DeLorean just can't go 88 miles an hour out here. It's too dangerous. So you're going to have to do it in your imagination. So we're going to go back in time. We're going to go back to the 13th or 14th century, and we are going to, since we're going back in time, let's just go to Paris. Let's go back to Paris in the 13th or 14th century. I want you to think of this historically, but I want you to think of it more than just historically. I also want you to think of the way that this frames people's imagination. So if we were to go in that time machine back to the 13th, 14th century in Paris, Notre Dame is being built, 100 years of building it. We would be entering and walking the streets, if I can have my slides back up, we would be in a world that we could call secular zero. This is hard for us to even imagine. But if you were to go back even 500 years ago, 600 years ago, in the Western world, and you were to walk the streets of Paris, you would be in a world where there is no secular. The dial of the secular is set at zero. Now, of course, people understood. If you talk to anyone, they knew if they went into the cathedral that when the priest gave you the Eucharist, the chalice that the priest used was a sacred thing. They knew that. And they knew when they went outside Paris and worked the fields and they used a hoe or a shovel, they knew that was a profane thing. And by profane, I don't mean bad or gross. I mean simply wasn't used in holy exercise. But for the most part, all of those things really linked together. It was like a puzzle. They all fit together. It was nearly impossible. It was almost completely impossible in a secular zero world to imagine that belief and action were separated. These things were glued together so tightly you couldn't see air between belief and action. They were everywhere you went within the society, it taught. The liturgy spilled from the cathedral. It was everywhere. You couldn't really function and not be someone who believed. So if you went back to this world, it was nearly impossible to find an atheist. If you lived 500-600 years ago in the West, there were no atheists. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this person in this statue. I always say that as a lead-in, and I'm waiting for the person to go, yeah, I know exactly who that is. Because you would have to be an ultimate statue nerd. And I don't know, are there even such things of people that are super into statues? I don't know. But this is a statue that's in Venice, Italy. And a few years ago, I had a John Templeton grant. That was a great grant, but it had a terribly dull name. It was called Science for Youth Ministry. And what we were trying to do is have the science faith conversation with high school kids. And one of the things that we did, which I'm really, really good at spending other people's money, so like I got great ideas about how to spend, not my own money, but some foundation's money. So we thought, what would be cool with these high school kids is if we could take like 20 of them and we could go to Italy and we could do a Galileo pilgrimage. Like we could walk the steps of Galileo and then talk about the scientific revolution and how Galileo was connected to the church and how he never even denied his faith and how his even thoughts were really imbued in a deep sense of belief. It was great. And, pasta. So we decided let's do this. So we also, again, I'm so creative spending other people's money. So we're like, what we should also do? Let's bring along a historian. So we got the name of this guy at the University of Wisconsin who just retired. His whole career was European scientific revolution and faith. His name was Mike Shank. Nicest guy you'd ever meet, but made you feel incredibly dumb because Mike was so smart and he spoke fluently every European language and just could go in and out of them. And we had a great week together. We actually had much more fun with Mike than we did with the kids, but that's a whole nother thing. But I had the privilege of dropping Mike off at this monastery in Venice, Italy, when we said goodbye to him. He was going to stay and go to the library and do further research. And so we dropped off his bags at this monastery, and he's like, before you go, I got to show you this. And he takes me to the statue. And we go off the Grand Canal and some side canal, and there's just the statue. And he tells me, he says, this is a statue of a man by the name of Paolo Sarpi. Does anyone know who Paolo Sarpi is? Paolo Sarpi is famous really for two things. One, and mainly, he's famous for being Galileo's friend, which is why Mike is showing me this statue. So he was Galileo's close friend and really encouraged Galileo to publish his book that got him in hot water with the Pope. The other thing he's famous for is at the Council of Trent that gathered to try to make sense of what the Catholic Church is going to do after the Reformation. Paolo Sarpi was invited and was the dissenting voice, which means he was a pain in the butt to everyone there. But Mike shows me this, and he says, you got to see the statue, but you really got to look at the plaque underneath it. And this is what the plaque says. And if you go today, you'll have to find some hunky Italian guy to translate it for you because it's in Italian. But it says Paolo Sarpi, of course, date of birth, date of death. And then there's this quote in Italian. And this is the quote. It says, Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. Now, we're talking early 16th century. But in the early 16th century, if you don't believe, you get a statue. That's amazing. Yeah, the traffic in Southern California is not good. If there was a statue for every unbeliever in Southern California, really try to get down the 405. I mean, that would be, up in LA or down the 5. I mean, it would be terrible. But that's what happens. It was really hard in a secular zero world to not believe. The whole society passed on belief. It was hard to function and be part of this society without a deep sense of belief. Belief was everywhere. Now, it's very hard, I think, for us to imagine what it would be like, particularly to be late modern people like we are, and what would it even be like to go back to a secular zero world. I don't even know what that would be like. I don't know how to even imagine that. I do know one TV show that's done a thought experiment, imagining what it would be like to be modern and then go back to something like secular zero. And it's a very frightening dystopian TV show called The Handmaid's Tale. Have you seen The Handmaid's Tale? Some of you have seen it. If you haven't seen it and you don't want to sleep for a week and you just want to be frightened, watch it. I mean, we have dystopian shows everywhere now, of course, but this is a pretty dark dystopian show. If you don't know about this TV show, I think they're in season 4 or something now, but they're based, and particularly season 1 is based off a novel by a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood. And she writes this in the mid-1980s, and she imagines what would happen if America fell. And a group takes over America, and they rename America Gilead, and they take America back to secular zero, essentially. They take it back to a world where there is no secular. And it is very, very frightening. No more America, which actually isn't quite true. If you've watched the show or read the novel, you know that America does exist. Like there's an enclave of America that exists as just a very small group in Toronto, which I got to tell you, people, just feels to me like the ultimate Canadian fantasy, doesn't it? I don't think that this is dystopia. I think this is a fantasy piece of literature, It's like eating their pancakes and their maple syrup and thinking, what if America was just a small enclave in Toronto? But it's a frightening show, and Margaret Atwood thinks it's absolutely a frightening nightmare to imagine that you could be modern and slide back to this. And one of the things that's haunting about the TV show particularly that they do so well is, well, belief and action is everywhere. They're one and the same. So even how you dress reflects the hierarchical shape of God's universe. So the way you dress signals where you stand in this deep sense of social belief. The liturgy spills out from the religious space. So one of the things you take away from season 1 is how, like, when these women go to the supermarket, they say, "Under his eye, and may the Lord open." You are punished if you don't reiterate the liturgy at every social engagement. It is nearly impossible to not believe in these cultural contexts. It's just so fused together, and it's impossible to leave it. You know, I talked to a lot of denominational officials, bishops, others across Protestantism, and everyone is really afraid about people leaving the church, young people particularly leaving the church. Not one of those folks from across the Protestant continuum, not one of them has ever said to me, "You know what we're going for in our district? You know what we're going for in our synod? You know what we're going for in our presbytery? We're trying to get back to the Handmaid's Tale. I mean, if we could get back to the Handmaid's Tale, then everything would be great." And at a certain level, well, I mean, if it's just about keeping people, I mean, that's the whole point of the show, is that people are trying to get out of Gilead, and you can't get out of Gilead. Not only can you not escape it, but as we see in the later seasons, it gets inside of you in a certain way, and you can't get out of it. But that's a frightening thought to most of us, that we could go back to that. Now, one of the reasons Margaret Atwood thinks it's so frightening, and maybe some of us do too, is because you need 3 things to live in a secular zero world that I just don't think we have necessarily anymore. So the 3 things you need to be living in secular zero is you need a deep sense that the world is an enchanted place, that there are devils and demons everywhere, that angels are everywhere. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean, and we can continue to unpack this, that certain individuals might not believe that. I think we can find all sorts of individuals. But the larger institutional structures of society in a modern world tend not to run in this kind of enchanted way. So you need to have a deep sense of enchantment, and I'll continue to unpack that. The second thing you need is you need to have a sense that things you can touch and feel could be imbued with either a divine or an evil force. And if you're near those things, it can affect your very being. So if you are worried about young people in your church, maybe one of the things you would do at lunch is gather some people around your area and say, "We're really worried that our high school kids aren't committed, or there's deep temptations going on with them. You know what we should do is we should see if we could kind of pool together our resources and we could buy Peter's teeth." You know? If we could get Peter's teeth here and just have our high school kids walk past them once a week, you know, and maybe say a prayer next to them, then that'd be good. And there was a sense in the secular zero world that if you could just get people near these holy things, that it would impact their very being, which also then tells you that you have to have a sense that the self is porous, that even being close to something could get into the very essence of what it is. So one of my favorite stories, there's actually a great book by a Oxford historian named Keith Thomas, who's written this book called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And he's looking particularly at the middle of the medieval period. And he tells this story that I find really quite fascinating, that in the 12th century, there was a major controversy. And the major controversy going around the Church of England is that they discovered that people were going to the cathedral to take communion, to take the Eucharist. The host was being put on their tongue, and then they discovered that people were not swallowing it. They were holding it in their mouth, and they were leaving the cathedral. They were going home, and they were putting it on their field. They were breaking it up and putting it on their field, or they were feeding it to their sick pig. Not in disrespect, in utter respect for it. They believed that it was imbued with a divine power, and if you needed a good harvest to survive next year, why not get the host into the ground and maybe you get a better harvest this year? Or you need this pig to survive for your livelihood, why not feed it this holy magical thing? Well, you can understand that the priests, the bishops, the cardinals were very, very worried about this. So they had a pastor's day, just like you all are. And the tweet that went out to say, come to Pastors Day, say, we're going to talk about a cutting edge issue that we have to deal with here. I mean, it's on the header of the tweet, and then all the advertisement, and that this year, Pastors Day, discussion, how to get people to swallow the host. So they gathered in a room like this, and they really kicked it around. Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to solve this issue? And some genius in the room raised, it would have been his at that time, his hand, and they pointed to him, and he's like, I got an idea. Why don't we make people stick out their tongues? And now you've seen it. Like, if you've watched a Italian or Irish gangster movie, you know, thanks to Martin Scorsese, there's always a montage of murders cut with First Communion. You know, like, this is the great mob boss's alibi. Is I couldn't have killed all those people because my son was having his first communion. And then the symbolism of the spilled blood and then the first communion. But you see it, the mob boss goes before the priest, hands behind back, because you can't touch this thing. This is a holy thing. Tongue goes out, bread, host goes on tongue, swallowed, and then like a 4-year-old with a sore throat at the doctor's office, you show the priest that you've swallowed that thing. And that goes all the way back to like the 14th century. Well, the other thing you have to do is you have to remind people, not only do you have to say, stick out your tongue, so let's see that you've swallowed this, but you have to remind people that if they do not, or they misuse this, they can very easily, I mean, this is a very holy thing. If you misuse this, you will burn in hell forever. Like, this is not anything to play around with. So you ramp up the rhetoric of damnation that could come with this. So what they discovered is, after ramping up that rhetoric, that people became quite frightened to take communion. And it became church law that you had to take communion twice a year. And not shockingly, most people took it twice a year. That they would go before the altar to take communion and they would shake, not sure what was going to happen. Not sure if this holy thing would go into them and it would tear their soul apart. But it was better than the alternative, which is if you didn't take communion twice a year, you would be pretty much making your reservations for hell. So the risk was there, but they did it. Frightening. Now, my guess is there's some of you, and this would be true at my church that my wife's the pastor of, that if you ask some people, like, what's the most meaningful worship experiences that they have, they would say, well, when we take communion, it's so meaningful to me. Now, if our ancestors in the faith could hear some of us saying, particularly our medieval ancestors, could hear us saying, oh, you know what, communion is just so meaningful to me. I just love it. I love the music. I love the fact that we get to get up and move. It's my favorite part of church. They would think we were nuts. Like, they would think that sounds so weird. It would be similar to being in a Bible study and having someone in the Bible study say, you know, I just want you all to know that I am having surgery on Tuesday, and I just want you to know this. I love having surgery. I just love it. I don't know. There's just something about surgery it's just really moving to me. You know, like, I don't know. It's just like the whole rhythms of it, you know, like the anesthesia and you know, there's like a percentage chance you might not ever wake up. I just love that. It's just kind of so meaningful. And then the thought, like, I'm somewhere else, but someone's cutting my body open. Oh my gosh. It's just like, I don't know. It makes me feel alive. Like, you would think, okay, this person needs a psychological review. Like, there's something not right here. That's how our ancestors would feel hearing us say, like, I just love communion. It's just so great. It's not to say it's wrong to say that. I'm just saying very different imagination of what was going on here. Now, I have an 18-year-old son who I want you to know. I know this is being zoomed out, so I want this to be very, very clear that I love this boy. I want you to hear that. I would die for this kid. That's not even hyperbole. I love him. He's a wonderful human being. He is great. He's a pain in the ass. He's the biggest contrarian that's ever existed. I could say the sky is blue, and he will say, no. Like, he just denies everything. Beautiful kid, a little bit too smart for his own good, you know, the kind of kid. So it has been a struggle with this boy since he was little. Like again, lovely. I would die for this kid. He's a great kid. But he's a firstborn child being raised by two firstborn kids. My wife's a firstborn. I'm a firstborn. So you should see the power struggles on this and how our daughter just kind of skates as the sweetest one ever. And the three of us are like, no, I'm in control. No, I'm in control. No, I know better. No, I know better. It's poor kid. It's really not his fault. It's ours. But he is. Like since he's been 5, it's just been a power struggle all the way through. So a few years ago, he was 16. In our church, we are a small church in South Minneapolis. So when we take communion, we take it in a circle. It's this beautiful moment where everyone kind of leaves their pews and we stand in a circle. And my wife gives the words of institution over the elements. And then a basket of bread, it goes kind of counterclockwise around and the cup follows it. And it's this beautiful moment where you get to take the elements and turn to the person next to you and by name give it to them as a real expression of the community and the sacramental community living this out. So as this particular Sunday, it's happening and the bread starts going counterclockwise. I'm at about 6 o'clock with my son. It starts going around at 12 o'clock. And my son turns to me and he whispers and he says, hey, is that bread? Is that bread gluten-free? Is that gluten-free bread? Now you need to know that this boy hates everything gluten-free. He just despises gluten-free. He thinks it's the worst thing that's ever existed because, of course, naturally, his mother's gluten-free. So that means it's awful. So I know that this is a problem. So it's coming around and he says, hey, is that bread gluten-free? And I don't even look at him. I just say, yeah, it's gluten-free. And this is what this kid does. He turns to me and then in a stage whisper, so pretty much everyone can hear, he goes, well, I'm out, and turns around and walks out of church. Now, I have to tell you, people, this is a confession. I'm confessing to you. It took everything in me to not tackle the boy and beat him in front of the whole church. But just think of that different imagination to people in the 13th century, 14th century, going before the altar to get communion, shaking, not knowing what would happen to them. To my 16-year-old kid, like, I just don't like the texture of gluten-free, and I would like to really annoy my mom, so I'm just going to leave right now. Very different kind of cultural imagination here. So we just don't have these kind of three things. And we do forget often that even when we kind of think of the sense of the things, that if you go to Paris today and you go to Notre Dame or you go to CPL, which is on the island as well, and beautiful stained glass building. And of course, you go into Notre Dame and you know it's just huge, huge building. It was built, both of those chapels, the cathedral and then the chapel, were built because King Louis, received Jesus' crown of thorns. They weren't for functions. They weren't like, hey, it did serve that way. Like guilds could gather and have meetings in there. Storms happened. It was a great place to be. But really the purpose of building those was because you had a thing that was imbued with the divine force. And you needed a beautiful building to symbolize this holy thing, this holy relic that was there. There's a deep sense of how that functioned. We, again, just don't quite have that. And even with this sense of our own selves being porous, here's, again, my PBS. Watch too much PBS. But did anyone watch Victoria? Like, there was 2 or 3 seasons of Victoria. And so I think it's season 2, Victoria is pregnant. And in the TV show, she's told London is opening a zoo as well. And she's told she's not allowed to go to the zoo. Because the idea being, and her doctors tell her she's not allowed to go to the zoo. Because the idea is, the thought of the time was that if she sees an elephant, there's a good chance her child will come out with big ears. And this was very common. And that's the 19th century, folks. Like, that's not even like 14th century. That's the 19th century. But there was very much an idea of what you see outside could affect your very being. Again, we don't tend to function that way. We have more of a buffer between what's out and what's in. Maybe you've had that experience. Maybe it happened this morning where you walked in here and you just felt it. You were just like, I hate everyone here. Why am I here? And now there's this dude in front of me who's annoying me. Just get your coffee and move on. You know, like, you have those days where everything is just annoying you and you're angry and, you're just having a tough day. And usually when that happens, what do we think to ourselves? And this is probably a good way to think, that we think, oh, I really do need some caffeine. Or I didn't get enough sleep last night. You look at your sleep app and say, oh yeah, I didn't get any deep sleep. We tend to think when even those emotions race within us, we tend to think that there's some more natural material explanation. We tend to think that's not some kind of corruption of our soul. We tend to think didn't get enough sleep. That tends to be how we understand that. I think I have a video clip that maybe illustrates this from one of the greatest commercials of all time. See if you remember this commercial.
Mike, what is your deal, man?
Come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby! Eat a Snickers. Better?
There. That hurt.
You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
You can hear the buffer, right? You're not you when you're hungry. It's not really a spiritual condition. It's just that you're acting weird because you're hungry. There's some kind of buffer that doesn't get to the essence of your own being. You don't think of it as a moral, spiritual crisis. You think of it's a crisis that you need more calorie intake. So very different kind of imagination at play here. So if we were to summarize all this, in a secular zero world, what really matters for kind of the essence or the drive of pastoral practice, of what it even means to be a good pastor, is to give people access. And really access to the divine realm. And the pastor's job is to usher people into that. Now, I think we need to recover some of this. We also should be very aware that we're in this room together. I think all of us, in one way or another, we're together because giving people access also become quite corrupted. Hence, we're Protestants. And this movement of giving people access all of a sudden could be bought, or it could be just used over and against people, or there was just a certain class that controlled that access. So let's not be too nostalgic about this reality. But that was the objective, to give people access. It'd be very hard for someone in the medieval period, for any cleric, any pastor, to ever think, what am I doing? This doesn't make any difference. There's no meaning to this anymore, which we can often feel. You would never feel that. Like you were a vampire slayer. Like you were moving in and out of the divine and the human. You were ushering people into this deep, deep spiritual reality. Very different than I think where we're at today. All right, so where we're at is we haven't even really gotten into a secular age yet, but we do have to see it against this backdrop. So let's take a breath, turn to a couple people next to you. When you think of secular zero, what comes to mind? What questions do you have? What thoughts are you putting together? Take about 4 or 5 minutes. All right, we'll come back together. Is that 1 minute? I always say 1 minute. I can never... All right, so before I take you another step here, what thoughts do you have about secular zero or things you're putting together? And you'll have to remind me, I need to repeat what you say for those who are on Zoom. But what ideas do you have? What were some things you were talking about in your groups? Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it's right by the border.
Yeah.
So a lot of this isn't that far away.
Right.
Like how they receive communion, what is deemed holy, that, and also just visiting other parts of the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so to repeat this, and then you can tell me if I repeat it as well, is that working with a congregation close to the border, that some of this isn't that far away, that there are more than just echoes of secular zero even today. I think that's really true. So a few things to say about that is, one, to say that we never are really as modern as we think we are. And so I'll get to that. I mean, the other thing to say even before that is we are, for good and for ill, we are talking about the West. So let's be aware of that. Now, there's something I think that's both global about that because of the way globalization works. Some of these realities spill beyond the West, but we are talking about the West. The secular is a Western construct. So we just need to be aware of that, and we can continue to see how that affects things. But then back to, we're never quite as modern as we think we are. So there's two ways to point to that. Is, do you remember, sports fans will remember, a few Super Bowls ago, it's becoming maybe 5-6 Super Bowls ago, remember Tom Brady, terrific Tom Brady, led the greatest Super Bowl comeback in history. If you remember, the big story Monday after that epic Super Bowl that happened in Dallas is that they were reporting that someone had snuck into the Patriots locker room and had stolen Tom Brady's game-used jersey. And they had got the Texas Rangers out after this person. It became a big, even international story because they had gone over into Mexico to get this jersey back. Now think of this as just a pure modern rationalist. What? Why does anyone want some dude, his stinky grass-stained jersey? Again, just thinking as a pure rationalist, you don't. But of course, some of us in this room are like, I would die. I would do anything for Tom Brady's used jersey. Well, this is kind of an echo of this world. I mean, we have this deep sense of he did a great act within it, that we're closer to even the very essence of his being by habit. So we're never really as modern as we think we are. And all of these realities, I would guess if we looked at ourselves, we would have a deep sense of being enchanted ourselves or believing certain of these things. That said, there are certain really huge differences. And so, for instance, let me tell you this. Maybe this is more information than you want to know. But we moved into a house in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I live, which was built in 1912. Pretty old house for my part of the world. And we are only the second family to ever live in it since 1912. So there's been 3 owners. Person lived in it, was basically born in it, lived in it, took it over from his parents, died in the house. A small real estate company bought it, tried to flip it. We bought it from them. So we are the only second family to live in it. Guy who lived there was a recluse. He kind of died living only in one room. They cleaned it out. And so it became as we were living in it and kind of revamping it for ourselves, it became very creepy things started happening. My son at the time was he was 3, and he kept on saying things like, "Mommy, why is the man in the backyard?" And one night we were putting him to bed. He's like, "Mommy, the man's at the window." This is second level. The man's at the window, and he's going, "Ooh." So there's creepy stuff happening here, right? So one hot summer night, I'm sleeping with Owen. Again, he's 2 years old, 3 years old. So I'm sleeping with him, trying to get him to bed. And Cara, my wife, is in the bed alone. And it becomes like a sixth sense experience. All of a sudden, the temperature in the room just goes ice cold. It's 90 degrees, humid Minnesota night. It becomes freezing. And all of a sudden, the fan starts going, fa-fum, 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 fa-fum. And she says she feels pinned down by some evil force. So she can only pray. She could, her mom has Pentecostal leanings in her, so she prays in the name of Jesus, and it releases her. And then we do what you would do. What we should have done is get a Catholic priest to do some stuff, But we anoint the house, and we pray over each room, and there it goes. But here's my point. So, again, not quite as modern as we think we are. However, we're very modern in the sense that we don't really think about that story that much. It surely doesn't frame our lives. When we talk about it is when we're sitting around with friends and maybe we're having a glass of wine. You get 2 glasses of wine in and the ghost stories start coming out. Then it's oh yeah, we got to tell you what happened to us. But you know what there isn't? There isn't a plaque on our front step that says in 2006, July, Reverend Cara Root came face to face with the devil, and Jesus arrived here and cast it out. It's not every year commemorating that. Do people from my church come and pray at the step and remember this? There is no ritualized kind of symbolic structure to that. So of course it kind of disappears. It becomes like, you have to get buzzed on your coffee and sitting around with friends. You start talking like, oh, I had something crazy happen to me. All these uncanny experiences just kind of disappear because there isn't a larger symbolic ritualized structure to them like would have been in the medieval experience. The other reality of this is that we all might have those experiences. I live with those experiences, but if you got on an airplane, and those of you who fly a lot know, when you back out from the gate and you sit there for a while, and you have this internal clock within you, and oh my gosh, we've been sitting here a while. If that intercom system comes on and you hear a sigh, you know you're in big trouble. Like the intercom system comes on and you hear, hi folks, this is your captain. So my co-pilot and I here, we're getting some alerts on our dash. We've tried to restart the computer system a couple times, but they're not going away. So we're going to have to take the plane back to the gate, and we're just going to have to get a mechanic up here to take a look at this. We think it's no big deal. We just think this is a problem with the computer system. We should have us back out on that runway within 20 minutes. You're in trouble. Like, this is 2 hours. You're missing your connection. My guess, though, is all of us in this room, if that plane backed out and you sat there too long, intercom system came on, sigh, and the pilot said, hey folks, sorry about this delay. Just so happens that me and my co-pilot, we're getting some weird feelings up here. We just think there may be some demons up in those clouds. So we're going to just take the plane back to the gate here, and we got some shamans down there, and they're just going to put some holy water on these wings and do a couple sayings over things, and we'll get you right back up in the air. You could be the most enchanted person and be like, I want out. I'm taking a different airline. I'll walk. I don't want part of this. So it is really true that we have these experiences, and to not have them may actually be a kind of blockage to what really is real. Absolutely. It could be a reduction of what is real. But the whole institutional structures that we live within perpetuate disenchantment, perpetuate that things can't be imbued with the divine force and that the self is porous. And you get formed by it. This is back to the idea, or somebody said like that, you're not formed. Like you could somehow not be formed. Like that Wendy isn't forming her daughter. We're all formed by living in institutions that function this way. So we can go to any urban center in this country, you can go and find congregations that really are living out of this. But when they get HR reviews on Monday, it tends not to be around these realities. So we're never as modern as we are, and these modern disenchanted forces just kind of fall on us, and it becomes really hard to escape them. Does that make sense? It's a really, really long answer to your really important statement. Yeah.
Doesn't that speak into what you ended with the pastor's responsibility or opportunity is to help access the divine? Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. I often say, people that see the church, they come in because they know they can find God. Mm. Well, people that stay away from church stay away because they know they can go and find God. And so,
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do want to hold that, because I think the objective here, or yes, thank you, Chad. So your statement isn't part of what we're doing. Isn't there still something about pastoral ministry that's trying to help people have access? And I think that's absolutely true. And I also think that there's something in the way the secular unfolds that shifts it in a odd way. And I do want to point out that it is that we tend not to have these deep symbolic structures that exist. I was just in, my family and I just did this trip where we went to the Holy Land. We spent some time in Jerusalem. And we took them to Jerusalem and to Istanbul and then to Rome, because I cashed in all my airline miles for this. I have a senior in high school, and this is going to sound flippant and rock and roll, but I don't mean it to. But I feel, talk about framing or forming your kid. Our thought is we had a senior in high school. He's that contrarian firstborn kid. And my point is, if this kid's going to be an atheist, he's going to have to be a good atheist. And again, that sounds rock and roll. I don't mean that. I don't want him to be an atheist. I want him to confess the depth of the gospel. But it's amazing in this cultural context how many people refuse the church or Christianity, and it's like this thin veneered cultural Christianity. So if he's going to deny it, he's going to have to go to the 3 holy cities, see the depth of their beauty, and then be like, yeah, this is BS, or there's no meaning here, or these are just stupid people who believe. That's what he's going to have to do. What's that?
Also, he's going to have to read Nietzsche and Sartre.
That's right. He's going to have to read Nietzsche and Sartre. And, yes, there are good atheists and there are bad atheists. And on YouTube are a lot of bad atheists. And Nietzsche's a good atheist. He knows what he's talking about with Christianity. When he denies Christianity, he's denying the heart of Christianity. And so, sometimes when I want to get youth workers' attention, I'll be like, if you're going to make atheists, make good atheists. Have them really wrestle with the claims of the depth of Christianity. And then if they're like, well, that's BS, okay, well, that's an option here, but this kind of thin veneered. But my point is that we went to the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. We went to the place where Jesus was, as tradition says, Jesus was born. And what's fascinating, of course, is that there are churches on top of those. So the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, is landed right on it. Now, as a good Protestant, I had this sensibility of what would really be more edifying to my faith than the fact that there's this incredible church with all this symbolism and all of these stories, in all the architecture. It would be better for me if it was just exactly how it was, or as close to exactly how it was when Jesus was born. I want to see it how Joseph and Mary found it. And I want even Golgotha to be there it is. Now there's this church on top of it. But that is because I'm a modern Protestant. And somehow it seems edifying to my faith to get back to the way it was. But if you were a Byzantine Christian or a Catholic Western Christian, you go to a holy place, the thing itself. The place, nothing could be more imbued with the thing than the Holy Land itself. And what do you drop on top of it? A place where you can continue to symbolize and enact and in worship. You put a church on top of it. And one of those things that we just don't have, it becomes harder for people to even understand what you mean, Pastor, when you're talking about access, because they live in a quite ritually impoverished kind of sense of that. There's a lot more work that has to be done. And I'll explain that as we go, but it is a good point. Yeah. All right, one more, and then I'm going to take us forward in the story. Yep.
I was thinking about how people in secular zero
Yep.
versus now view us as church leaders.
Yeah.
And I felt judged by my staff that I confessed that I watched Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
And it was interesting during Roe being overturned, during the protests, that there was this interesting connection between Handmaid's Tale
Yeah.
and Roe being overturned.
Yeah. Yeah.
The world views people like us as church leaders.
Yeah.
Kind of equate those things together. And so it's we used to be the ones that give access.
Yeah.
Now we're looked at with skepticism.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to try to repeat this for Zoom people. Just the interesting kind of way culturally that even The Handmaid's Tale has become a kind of a form of protest politically, which you do see, people dress in their Handmaid's Tale kind of perspective and think that they're going that direction. But it highlights even the way one might welcome the supposed kind of clerical voice or the pastoral voice, where before, my gosh, how do you live without it? They say the medieval period was broken up into 3 types of people. And you didn't get to choose, my goodness gracious, but you were filed away into 3 types of people. There were those who worked, those who killed, and those who prayed. There were the peasant laborers, there were the knights of the realm that protected the realm, and then there were the monks and the priests. And the monks and the priests were the most important ones. They ordered all else, which is why if you were a very good knight, by the end of your life when you were too old to fight anymore, you would be taken into being a monk. There's like a whole, at least in some of the orders, there was a way that you would your retirement would be to be a monk, that you'd fought for the realm, and now you get to kind of be filed into that. There was a sense, I think in every period, we have to remember that, especially in the West, that the reform movements were starting quite early. Like if Luther nails his 95 Theses in 1517, it has been at least 100 years of people feeling discontent with what was happening in the church, feeling like access was being reworked. So there's not just one Reformation. There had been 100 years of people pushing back. So there was, of course, in some villages, people like, yeah, this corrupt priest who keeps, saying one thing and doing it. And there was still some of that. But there was no questioning of the whole order. You couldn't question the whole order. There's no sense that this didn't all kind of reflect a divine reality, and that you absolutely needed a group of people who were praying for the realm. And the thought was, if they weren't there praying for the realm, we would be in trouble. Disaster would come. That not is quite true right now. There's not people who are like, well, we need to make sure that there's a group of people who are always praying for our realm. They think, at least some, of course, think that is a corrupting move that's there to take away people's freedom. Fascinating. Well, we haven't even got to the secular. So we have set these terms, gives you the backdrop of a secular zero world, but the secular does arrive, and it arrives as what we might call secular one. And if we wanted to define secular one, we would define it as this kind of negotiating between public and private. Now, what happens that is a very, very radical change is that belief becomes a private thing. So let me say it this way. Maybe this will help it make a little sense. Remember your grandmother? She taught you at one point, or somebody taught you in your life, that to be a polite person when you go to a dinner party, there are 4 topics that polite people don't talk about at dinner parties. For instance, when you go to a dinner party, or today at lunch, you don't know a ton of people here, so part of the reason you're here is to meet people, but, you want to be a polite person as you meet people. There's probably 4 topics at lunch that you shouldn't talk about. You shouldn't come up to somebody and say, hey, what's your political affiliation? You shouldn't really just start talking politics, especially if you don't know them. Now, this is very hard in our time because politics has become entertainment. But for the most part, it was kind of hung on here that you were not supposed to talk about politics at a dinner party. Second thing that is more true is that you really should not ask someone that you sit down across and say, hey, introduce yourself and say, so I was just wondering, how much money do you make? Don't talk to people about how much money they make. That's rude. That's not something you should talk about. Third thing, of course, your grandmother told you should never talk about at a dinner party that I think is hung on very strongly is don't ask people about their sex lives. That is not polite. Polite people don't do that. And then the fourth thing is that you don't talk about what? Religion. You don't talk about religion. Why don't you talk about politics, money, sex, or religion? The idea is those 4 things are private. And polite people do not talk about private things in public. This is a world of difference. The secular arrives when we have this assumption that belief is a private thing. Hence why Wendy can say what Wendy says. Belief is private, but what really matters is the public action. And there doesn't necessarily have to be a direct correlation between those, really. This is very different. Now the pastor, the job is to somehow enter into the private space and help people come to believe something and then demonstrate it publicly. But for the most part, it's now having to cross this. It's not just rational, but it's somewhere internal. It's not outside in the symbols and the practices. It's somewhere internal. And it's a little bit like, as this kind of modern secular one arrives, especially in pastoral practice, is a little bit like vampires. The lore of vampires, where vampires are not allowed in your house unless you invite them in your house. It's pretty much how we function as modern people. That people do not want the pastor in their private life unless they invite the pastor in their private life. So if you said, hey, I've noticed that I'm very uncomfortable with how you're raising your kids, say that to somebody in their congregation. They'll say, listen, pastor, thank you, but that's none of your business. That's our private reality. If we're in crisis, we may say, pastor, could you come and help give us some advice on how to raise our kids? Can you make a referral for us? Could you listen to us? But until I ask, you're not allowed in. It's like vampires. And that's very different. That your business is only when you're invited into it. So a few things change here. The first is that, as you can see, wills become very important. How people will this. Belief becomes connected to will. Will you willfully hold to this? Will you willfully participate and demonstrate? Will you willfully say this is meaningful to you? Very different imagination than secular zero. Let me continue with my PBS cred here and show you just a 2-minute news piece. Remember, this is hard to remember because it happened before the pandemic, and it's almost hard to remember anything before the pandemic. But remember that terrible day when you got word that Notre Dame in Paris was on fire? You're like, oh my gosh, it was terrible. And then people became very obnoxious, putting on Twitter and Facebook their picture at Notre Dame when they were like, semester abroad, and everyone had to flex that they've been to Notre Dame, and now it was on fire. But I want to just play a news story for you of them interviewing the night that it had set ablaze. They interview, on this piece, you'll hear an interview with a woman, and she is the dean of the Episcopal Chapel in Paris. And listen to how she talks about this. And I just want you to take this in, not as a critique. Actually, I don't think this should be a critique at all. But listen to how different it is than this secular zero perspective.
Led is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survived.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise...
Right? You hear it really clearly. It's almost as if I paid her to say that, because she really illustrates it. And I have to tell you, again, I just need to reiterate this because I'm still slightly traumatized by it. I am not critiquing her. If I had a camera in my face, I would answer it this exact same way. And I think she may even be right. But I showed that clip to the Council of Bishops in the Episcopal Church, and a few of them got super mad at me. And they were like, did you ask her permission to show that? I was like, it was on TV. I didn't know I needed a signature of consent if it was on TV. Like, I got this off YouTube, man. Like, I don't know. But they were really mad at me. So I want to be very clear. I think she's a very smart person. I agree with what she's saying. But against the backdrop of secular zero, very different. She says, Jesus' crown of thorns. Is it really Jesus' crown of thorns? Do we know for sure? Very modern question, by the way. Is it really Jesus? Well, in some sense, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter because the thing doesn't matter. What matters is the faith it invoked, that people prayed with it, that it did something to them in their own kind of private sense of belief. That's what really matters here. Very different conception of this. But this becomes a challenge if you are a faith leader in any way. It's like, how do you get people to enact this? How do you get them to see it as important? How do you get them to grab hold of this? That becomes a very different challenge. And it's right around this time, of course, that every modern denomination exists. And every modern denomination exists across whether evangelical or mainline. Every denomination, and I think every denominational leader knows this as well, is that every denomination can only exist for one more generation. Okay, now let me really be clear about that because that also sounds very rock and roll. I am not saying that every denomination will only exist for one more generation. I'm saying that every denomination can only exist for one more generation if the next generation does not willfully decide to enact their life that way. There will be no Nazarene church if the next generation does not decide to be Nazarene. And the school that, in the denomination that I serve in my seminary, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, there will be no Evangelical Lutheran Church in America if the next generation does not willfully decide to enact their lives that way. That is all the runway is. The next generation has to do it. Again, no Orthodox or Catholic priest, particularly in the medieval period, could ever imagine that. You just do the Mass. The Mass is a reflection of heaven. It is taking people in it. The thought that people could just not into it, and therefore this all could disappear, you couldn't imagine it. We all live with that burden. I mean, you kind of know whether you face it or not as a pastor, and I think it is not a real healthy thing, like on your watch this could go away. And some of you actually are told, and you live under the burden of it, it's your fault. I mean, you may not actually think it's your fault, but you wonder. You wonder. And I hope you can feel released from that because it's not your fault. But there is a certain sense like you better get creative or it all goes away and it will happen on your watch and you should feel really shameful for that. And I think these are bigger forces, and that kind of perspective will actually push you into a rut of ministry that is not healthy or faithful anyhow. But we can feel that. And this is why every modern denomination, at least particularly the mainline ones that I know, they have every 2-3 years a big, at least in the denomination I'm in, it's called the youth gathering, where they get all the young people, all the Lutheran young people get together. And it's fascinating in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, like a lot of denominations, the denominational headquarters, the church-wide it's called, has just cut budgets and cut people over the last 10 years. I mean, just amazing. There's one budget line that has lost some money, but not nearly as much as the others, and it is the youth gathering. Now, at one level, that's beautiful. They care about the next generation. They also know that if they don't get the next generation to willfully decide to enact their lives as ELCA Lutherans, it will not exist. So it is in their interest to make sure they fund that, and they have this youth gathering. And they do. Every 3 years, about between 20 and 40,000 young people and adults show up at some sports complex, and they have about 4 days of celebrating what it means to be Lutheran. And it works, at least for 4 days. I was at one about 4 or 5 years ago. It happened to be in San Antonio. And then I was walking in the convention center, and it was a majorly great one. I mean, the music was going, there were people everywhere, the excitement was ramped up. And I was walking in the convention center, and I happened to become, again, this is another confession, I became like creepy middle-aged guy listening to high schoolers' conversation, you know? I didn't mean to, but I was stuck in the hallway, and I overheard these girls talking. Now, this may offend you, but in my imagination, they looked like they were like juniors in high school, and in my imagination, they were from California. This might offend you, but it's just a lot more fun to tell this story if they're from California. Sorry, you're gonna hate me as I get stereotypical about that. But these two girls were walking in front of me, and they were just in the glow of this event, and they were clearly really good friends. And one of the girls kicked her friend, like this kind of thing, like you do that, and it's supposed to be like, where'd that come from, But of course, the girl got kicked, knew it. And so she gets kicked, and she turns to her friend, and she just kind of plays this up in this kind of playful banter, and she looks at her friend, and she's like, oh my gosh. This is where it's more fun if they're from California. I'm sorry. She says, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just kicked me. And I'm listening into this, and then this is what this girl says. She says, I can't believe you just kicked me. She said, that is such an un-Lutheran thing to do. And it seriously stopped me in my footsteps, and I thought, what? Un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing to do? Like, she kicked her friend. I thought, if she turned to her and said, hey, that was a very unethical thing to do, or that's not a very biblical thing to do, that would make sense. But she said, that's a very un-Lutheran thing to do. And I thought to myself, if she would have turned to her, instead of kicking her, put her arm around her and said, I know we're hearing all this stuff about justification by faith alone, but I want you to know it's your works that save you. That would have been a very un-Lutheran thing to do. But this wasn't un-Lutheran. But she got it. She got why the denomination had dropped millions of dollars into this event. She was trying on for 4 days what it would be like to see herself as Lutheran. Did it last past that week? No idea. But if you are running a modern denomination, it's worth a try. It's worth a try, because you got no hope if it doesn't. Now, again, I just want to point out this sense of you have to willfully consent. You have to willfully believe it. And of course, this has something to do with Protestantism in itself. How are you enacting this? So I grew up in a conservative Lutheran denomination, and my pastor was a major lover of Luther. But I remember the one sermon. Now, this is kind of depressing. I remember one sermon from my youth. And I was like the church kid. Like, I was like, helping out with VBS. I loved it all. And I remember one sermon. So that's a whole nother presentation we have to think about. But I remember one sermon. And it was the one time my Lutheran pastor preached a Jonathan Edwards-like sermon. And this is what I remember him doing. There's one sermon I remember. He said, I was like sitting in the corner, kind of listening. And he said to the congregation, if you waste time, you steal from God. All time is God's time, and if you waste time, you steal from God. Examine yourself. Do you waste time? And I remember sitting in the corner, and it just kept going over and over in my mind. If I waste time, I steal from God? And I kept thinking about it, and then I was like, my gosh, I'm in 5th grade. I go to school from 8:30 to 3:30. I hate school. Over these last 6 years of school, I have become a time-wasting savant. Like, that's what I do. I waste time to get through the day. I daydream, and I draw little things, and I make notes to my friends. I just couldn't get my mind around it. But again, this was his Jonathan Edwards sermon, where Jonathan Edwards, kind of in this period, used to preach to his folks. It's a good Puritan kind of reality that builds America, is that you need to examine yourself internally every day, every minute. Every minute of every day is God's. Every minute of every day is God's. How you raise your kids, how you talk, everything is God's. Continue to examine yourself. Continue to bend yourself willfully towards this kind of obedience. Very high bar. We forget that about Protestantism. It had a very high bar until the 19th century. It didn't. But it had a very, very high bar. But you can see how this becomes this internal thing. Do you willfully consent? Will you willfully believe it? Well, for this to happen, you have to have another change too, which is you have to have a switch from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. So do you remember this date? Again, this is before the pandemic, so maybe it's hard to remember this, but do you remember January 31st, 2018? Of course, a lot of you do, and as soon as I put that date up there, you started to get the shivers, because most of you, especially those of you who are pastors, solo pastors here, or main task is pastoral care, you've never been more busy than the 2 weeks before this and the 2 weeks after. Remember? You probably still feel exhausted. Remember how busy you were? You all have a very blank look on your face because I'm playing with you. You weren't busy at all. But this was the date of the super red blood moon, right? Now, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that it would have been logical, and in a secular zero world, it would have definitely happened. But I would guess, you can tell me at lunch, but none of you had a full pastoral care schedule. Oh my gosh, everyone in my congregation wants to talk to me because they're all freaked out about the super red blood moon. You're doing pastoral care visits with a guy who's like, Pastor, I just interviewed for a job in Chicago. I may be moving my whole family to Chicago, but now there's this super red blood moon, so should I do it or should I not? Or, Pastor, we're trying to have a baby, but should we wait a little while there's a super red blood moon? What does this mean? And for the most part, no one cared. I mean, people cared enough to get out there and Instagram themselves with it. It was cool. But there wasn't a sense that it meant something, that there was a message in it. For the most part, people were like, yeah, that's cool. And if my alarm gets me up, I'll check it out. But for the most part, it didn't mean anything. But you can imagine in a different kind of disposition, in a different kind of imagination, there is a sense when you live in a cosmos as opposed to a universe, there's a sense that even the natural phenomenon has a message. I guess it's back to your point over here. Like, you need a pastor or a holy person to tell you even what the natural phenomenon means, what decisions you should make. And the whole even natural world has a story that's unfolding. We don't necessarily believe that now. And in some ways, hey, it's kind of good. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of nice that when my daughter keeps throwing a fit, that I don't think, every day, 3:30, about a half hour after school, I don't think, oh no, the devil is near. Get that Catholic priest. We need some exorcism on her room. It is nice to think, well, she's just really overwhelmed. Or to not think it rained this morning. Should I have come? Is there a message within that? I mean, it's probably nice that we don't live under that burden, but it also could be very impoverished. What meaning is there? Does this have any significance at all? I mean, I drove up, some of you probably drove up too, and there was an incredibly beautiful, full-arced rainbow. It was unbelievably beautiful. The colors were beautiful. And here I am going to talk about this. It was very hard for me to do the work to think, well, first of all, it was very hard for me to do the work to just say, praise the Lord, to be aware of the divine reality. It took work to remember how that's connected to a larger biblical story of the flood. But it would even took more work to even think, is there a message here? Is this somehow looping me and pulling me into a story? And like I said, maybe it's good that it's not, because maybe on the way up I see that rainbow and I think, God doesn't want me here today. God wants me to go into the rocks and pray all day. Or God is sending me somewhere else. And then Derek's like, well, dude, we have people showing up. Like, this is how you have to show up. So you can see in some ways it's kind of nice that people aren't just living by the whims of how they interpret that. But at another level, it's pretty impoverished. I don't know if any of you saw this on Twitter. There was a tweet going around, which, you should not be on Twitter because it's a garbage dump of awfulness. But there was this sometimes you run into beautiful videos, usually great videos about dogs. I think Twitter should only exist for showing us dog and cat videos. But there was this video going around last weekend of this Orthodox priest doing the liturgy in this outside service there's this beautiful icon of Jesus behind him. And all of a sudden, in the midst of this, how it's filmed, a dove comes and lands right on top of it. And it's incredibly moving. And chills went through my body. But also a big part of me was like, I don't know if I buy it. I wonder if they put bird seed up there to do that. And even part of me wants it to be that way. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of comfort in the fact that maybe I'm a little protected if it was just birdseed. It was just a trick. It was just movie magic. What an impoverished age to live in. Maybe not as dangerous of an age to live in. Don't have divine consequence everywhere, but also deeply impoverished. That it's hard for me. I mean, it's hard for me as a theologian who spends my time teaching pastors to remember that this is a world where God moves, that God acts within it. It's very easy for us to become disenchanted that way. So if it moves from access, we then move to demonstrate. So again, the best pastor, or maybe the kind of core thrust of pastoral ministry, it becomes about demonstration. How do you get people to demonstrate what is internal, external? How do you get them to demonstrate what's internal as external? To give you maybe the most on-the-nose example of this, some of us who grew up in evangelicalism in the 1990s remember this youth ministry practice that maybe some of us are traumatized by or others found important, but there was this little thing called See You at the Pole. Does anyone do See You at the Pole? Remember this? Which was a kind of classic reflection of this kind of pastoral imagination, is that what was important is that all the Christian kids on the first day of school, and I'm not throwing any shade on this, it is what it is. I found it hard, but it is what it is. And the idea was that you would go at the public flagpole and you would demonstrate. It was a demonstration of what was true internally, externally, in a very kind of radical way. And so this was a core kind of pastoral practice. So pastoral ministry was really about helping people demonstrate what they believed internally, externally. That was the kind of core to this. All right, we are at 10:36. Let's take a break. We're a little early for a break, but not really by much at all. So what we'll do is let's take ourselves a 10-minute break. Does that sound good, Derek? We'll take a 10-minute break, refuel on coffee. Then when you come back, please come back at 10 minutes, and I do mean 10 minutes. Then we'll debrief some of this, or even as you start to get your coffee, start maybe talking about some of it, and we'll give you some time in groups to make sense of this, and then we'll keep pushing the story forward. So let's take a break. We'll come back in this room at 10:02. So I've just given you 12 minutes. We'll come back at 10 to 11. All right, folks, we'll come back together now. All right. The good news is you like each other. That's good. Yeah, we're good at pretending. All right, let's, any insights you have about secular one, thoughts that you have as we've moved from access to demonstrate, thoughts about this? Anything you put together, questions you might have? We're good? Yeah, please.
I was really intrigued by this division between private space and public space. I just had a really interesting conversation with someone who described their faith as a really private thing, and I thought faith has been a deeply personal thing. It might be an intimate thing, but it's always been a communal thing.
Yeah.
That just because something's personal doesn't mean that it's private.
Yeah.
And I think especially in this particular portion of the secular age, which I'm sure we'll head toward, but like the era of internet privacy has changed how we think about what something that's private is therefore secret and therefore hidden.
Yeah.
Because something's personal and intimate doesn't mean that it's a secret.
Yeah.
That faith has always been embodied in communal practice.
Yeah.
So I find that
Yeah.
distinction is really interesting.
It's really interesting. Okay, so for Zoom, I have to try to synthesize your very, very important comment. But that it's fascinating to think about the difference between kind of private and personal, or even private as kind of walled off and individualized. Because I do think at certain times, even as this arrives, people don't necessarily think of even private belief being just my own individual thing. That, I do think that like in this secular one, there is a kind of sense that you still hold on to the loyalty and the duty of a larger group, but it is more happening internal. But I do think that's a really important point about how the communal fits in with all of this and how we make sense of it. And then the other thing you said, that to repeat for Zoom, but also to just highlight, is that we have a generation of people are kind of renegotiating what private actually means. And it isn't, I don't think, I could be wrong with how this works out, but I don't think it's a ending of private. It's a like tearing down the curtain between the public and the private. But it's almost a sense of not really being concerned or being able to control who is able to even look in. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and it's quite confusing, I think, in some ways. So it's just generations who are always worried about like Big Brother watching. Find a generation. I mean, they would have never imagined that you would have generations of people who actually do surveillance on themselves. I mean, that's just, like you show up here and you're like, at Point Loma University, everyone knows where, like there was a kind of sense where you don't do that. Like you keep your own privacy, and we kind of don't feel that way now, which I think one of the challenges in the context of ministry is helping people understand the difference between disclosure and confession. It's very, very tricky because disclosure, especially through kind of digital tools, can feel like confession because it's kind of an honest expression, but it often, to your point, is not bound in a community. There's an audience, but not a community.
Right. Or the difference between meaningful vulnerability that leads
Yes.
to connection and just emotional dumping.
Yes, well said. Yeah, I'm going to repeat that for Zoom. The difference between, you said it so well, between, say it again.
Real vulnerability that leads to
Yep.
connection.
Real vulnerability that leads to connection.
And just emotional
Just dumping. Which, yes. Yeah, really well said. Other thoughts you're putting together as we've gone so far? Insights you have? Oh, yes, please. Yeah. 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 It's a great question. So again, trying to repeat for Twitter, that we do kind of move in as we move into secular one. And the other thing to say to you, and this is I think always maybe something I've failed to help people understand, is that as we go from secular one, and obviously you can anticipate we're going to secular two, and then we'll get to secular three, this is not a kind of progressive stage theory. So it's more like thinking of it as like a kind of genus of a species or something. Like secular one arrives, and when secular one arrives, it doesn't leave, but things can get built on top of it, if that makes sense. So sometimes people will be like, well, my church is more of a secular 2 church than a secular 3 church. And at some level that could be true, but they're always playing all the time. So they're there. But I think what you're pointing to is that the arrival of secular 1 does, at least part of its birth, is a certain kind of engagement of a certain rational frame of mind. Not all of it, but part of it is birthed through a kind of rationalism, which leads a good amount of people to kind of have a certain kind of functional atheism, or the only time that you feel compelled in any way to need God is when you come up against the limit of what other institutional or scientific or medical knowledge or procedures could solve the problem. So this is, like you were mentioning, to say this is often called God of the gaps, or the Des Ex Machina. This kind of sense that the more modern you get, you fill in the holes in science, and just certain organization fills that in. And there is part of this that is, this is Max Weber, who is kind of the father of sociology in many ways, and also his main argument is that the more modern a society gets, the more it becomes disenchanted. And it's partly because it fills this all in. But it does take a certain kind of hubris in thinking that. But the challenge is then that any form of belief gets kind of pushed to the center, to there being not much there. Now, one of the things that I'm going to point to that I think is quite interesting about this kind of secular age is you would think if we could just completely embrace a God of the gaps kind of perspective and can solve these problems. You don't need a pastor because there are other therapeutic ways to deal with this, so on and so forth, is that you would think those who are really seeing this as good news had the belief that at some point we would push guilt away. That guilt is kind of a leftover sense of assuming that human beings are sinful and there's a God who judges, and the more we realize that's not true, or that sickness is because of God's judgment, or because rainbows are because of God's pleasure, and earthquakes are because of God's wrath. Once you start to answer all those questions, once you realize none of that's true, then eventually we're going to do away with guilt, because guilt is really left over from our inability to our inability to have answers and to call things mystery, you know? Which is another way to think about this. Now I'm in parenthetical. But what happens in this is that mystery, we tend to start to assume that mystery is a puzzle, and a mystery is the thing that we haven't got to the answer yet. So for instance, it's a mystery how we'll get to Mars, but we know that someday we're going to figure it out. Where the secular zero perspective, a mystery is that which transcends your being's capacity to hold it. You know, that's a very different kind of sense of mystery. But the idea is if we can get rid of mystery, and I do think that the kind of founders of this age were very uncomfortable in the 18th century with mystery being the answer to things. They were not comfortable with saying like, well, why are leaves green? Because it's the mystery of God. They didn't like that. They wanted to try to get to some answers to that. And it led to a very kind of rough pushing away of mystery. But the good that we were supposed to get out of this, back to my original point, was that eventually it would push guilt away. What are you guilty of? Well, guilt will be something left over. And Freud really thought once you can front the stories of your internal kind of issues of shame or whatever with your parents, then you can really release people and they'll never be guilty. One of the fascinating things of the 21st century is how guilty secular people are. They feel incredibly guilty. It just so happens they don't feel guilty to a divine law. They feel guilty to themselves. I let myself down. I could have been more. If I would have finished the degree. If I would have come up with that idea. I mean, I had this small business. I knew it could have been big, but I just couldn't do it. If I would have eaten better or worked out or whatever, there's so many things that you can easily feel guilty to. So, I mean, that's just one small example, but that the God of the Gaps perspective starts to answer questions, but it still has a hard time wrestling with some of the deeper existential realities that people have for meaning and purpose and things like that. But it plays into this story in a huge way, because what's out there publicly, I mean, one of the main places that this happens is that you start to think, for instance, those who lead us and organize our lives. You could just not imagine in secular zero, you would be in deep, deep trouble if you realized the king was disobedient to God. The king is God's representative on earth. And if the king does not keep God's commands and represent God's will, or we find out the king is evil, it will bring demise to all of us. In a secular one reality, when it comes to the public reality, like who's running the water system or who's the mayor of town, do we really care what they believe? We want the trains to run on time, people. That's what matters. I don't know. I would like a capable bureaucrat who doesn't believe this than a deeply believing person who doesn't know what they're doing. And that kind of political, how we organize our lives, starts to really bring this kind of secular sense in. Whoever is kind of in control of society, does it really matter what they believe? People in secular, absolutely. If the person who's in charge doesn't believe, the devil is loose within our towns. The praying class that holds this all together, they can't function. But now we're like, well, I don't know. Don't we need technical know-how? So there is a kind of echo of a God of the Gaps there. Yeah.
All right. One more question.
Yes, please.
From online here to include them. Are movies like Jesus Revolution helpful for visualizing stories of the divine in a person's life experience? Does reenactment of historical events like the Passion movie or a retelling of the Gospels like The Chosen help us move off secular zero?
It's a great question. It's a controversial one because now you're at claiming what you think about certain TV shows, and that is what people will really fight for, is your view of movies and TV shows and things like that. That's where you'll really offend people. Yeah, right. Right. Don't mess with what I watch. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a certain way that seeing those stories enacted can be quite moving. I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognize in any of those stories is that it becomes an interpretation of this. It is not in any way the kind of same thing as preaching a sermon, but there is a kind of interpretive decisions that are made within that. And I think one of the things it points to that, again, I'm pointing you to where we're going, but it does reflect that we are fundamentally narratival beings, that we have our being inside of stories. And there is no way not to. And I guess this is back to good old Wendy, our friend, is she kind of feels like, I'm going to create this hermetically sealed space for my kid to decide whatever my kid wants to decide, not realizing that there's no way for her to exist without being knit into a bunch of different stories. And she'll watch which stories hold more weight than other stories, and that she'll only even be able to make her sense. I mean, this is your point about being kind of communal people. There's just no way to live a human life outside of stories and narratives. So that's why those representations of biblical texts become quite controversial, because they can challenge some of the stories you hold and how dare you, or they can be incredibly meaningful to be able to think inside of those. But I think where they can be beneficial is just reminding us that we need stories, that narratives are really important. And I'll return to that on how important I think that is. Yeah. Let me take us a step further here, because we've just gone to secular 1. But of course, not shocking to you, what comes after secular 1 is secular 2. But in many ways, I think secular 2 is this radicalizing of secular 1. And again, like I say, it's being built on top of it. So once secular 1 arrives, it never not arrives. It would be very hard. I mean, maybe you can function this way, but I don't think really anyone can function without a public-private divide within them in some sense. You may not appreciate the way your society has dropped that into your lap, but it's very hard to function outside of it. It's kind of here. It's where we're at. But what happens in secular 2 is that this becomes kind of radicalized in the sense where we feel this real tension between religious spaces and a-religious spaces. So if we were to define secular 2 just really directly, is that secular 2 is the classic form of secularization. If we were to go back to the imaginary exercise I was going to take you through, which is to give you a note card and have you write your definition of secular, my guess is most of you would have written a secular 2 definition. If you look in the media, when the media says, oh, America is becoming more and more of a secular place, or secularization has led this denomination to have to sell 8 of its buildings that are now some of the best microbreweries in town. Like if when you look at that, and they say, see, secularization has happened, they mean secular 2. So the definition of secular 2 is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. This is often how we define the secular, that it's fewer and fewer people are participating in the religious institutions, the religious communities. What it tends to lead to, and this is our imagination of secular, is we do feel like there is quite a competition here between religious spaces and a-religious spaces. And it feels like what's happened is that a-religious spaces have grown and religious spaces are shrinking. And again, this is what I echoed before our break. Maybe you should feel really bad about that, because on your watch, things have shrunk instead of expanded. But we can feel that, and all of us do feel it in some ways. Like, my gosh, parents will drive their kids all around the state for this basketball tournament or that basketball tournament, but will not come to Wednesday night. Like we feel that kind of competition at play. Even if we don't really want it to be a competition, we do feel like people only have so much time and so much energy, and they're doing these things instead of these things. And you then really feel like the form of ministry is, how do we give value added enough to people that they choose at least a little bit more the religious space over the a-religious space. So I have a student, former student, was a friend of mine now, who's a pastor in a suburb of Minneapolis, and he told me that he did a very terrible thing that I would recommend you never, ever do for the good of your soul. He Googled his church. Yeah, see, you people get it. Sometimes I say that to people, and they're like, who cares? Well, he Googled it, and he saw that he had 9 Google reviews of his church. And then he did the awful thing, which is if you Google your church and you see your church has been reviewed, never read the reviews. But he clicked and started reading them. And he thought that was fine because when he looked at his rating, it was like 4.9 stars or something. It's like, wow, I'm doing pretty good. I could use a pick-me-up this week. So he starts reading this, and they are really pretty good. They're pretty good reviews. Except this kind of wave comes over him, and he starts getting sick to his stomach because he starts to realize they all are written in the same format that you would write an Airbnb review. They're all really focused on the amenities. We love this church. The carpets are always clean. This church is great. They are committed to always sanitizing the nursery toys every 2 weeks. We feel very safe having our daughter in the nursery. This church is great. The preaching, it's pretty good. It's worth driving 15 minutes to. Like, this was all 9 of these reviews. And this is the struggle living inside of secular too, is that you are competing for more and more people's attention, for more and more people's participation, to try in some way. Maybe it's not to grow the religious space over the religious space, but just don't lose as much ground too fast. So it really then means that the kind of core here is participation. So obviously participation is a form of demonstration, but really what becomes important is participation. So the best pastor is the pastor who wins the most participation. We do this to ourselves all the time. I mean, I'm setting you up for a bad lunch because almost the first question every pastor asks another pastor they meet after name is, oh, where's your church? That's second, okay? And then third is, how big's your church? Now, I get it. Sometimes we just do that it's just conversation. But there's a certain moral weight to that question. There's a certain kind of performative dynamic to that question. How big is your church? If you look at most of the even kind of popular faith formation literature that's out there, there's almost always the equating of faith to participation. And one of the reasons for that is because, God bless them, it's following a lot of sociological trends. And I say God bless sociologists. I love sociologists. I love reading sociologists. Some of my best friends are sociologists. God bless them. But sociologists are in a field, and the field, at least especially its American version, counts stuff. That's what sociology does. It counts stuff against trends over time or in relation to environment. It counts things. So this is not bad on their part, but when they want to look at the state of religious life in America, they have to find measures that they can count. One of the things that can be counted is they can ask people, how often do you participate in church? Once a week? Twice a week? Once a month? Twice a month? And it's really become pretty paradigmatic now that when we talk about the state of Protestantism in America, we tend to say, and what is really fascinating is we talk about the state of faith in America. We can say, see, it's in a bad place because people aren't participating anymore. Now we have to be careful because there's something really important about participation. We are bodies, and bodies need to be together. And there's something significant about actually having spaces where bodies can be together to hear stories. We are not just storied beings, but we are embodied story beings. So there is something important about participation, but I'm not so sure that what it means to live in a secular age is that it's just that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Now, this is an issue, and if you are a pastor or running a denomination or running a center at a university, you're very, very aware that fewer people could mean very hard to get roof fixed. I teach at a denominational seminary. We're more aware than ever that if another 20% of the denomination goes away, why in the world would they need 7 seminaries. Why would they? And I like my job. I like it a lot. And I like being able to, feed my kids and do the things that we have to do. I like insurance. So I don't want us to be flippant about this. I don't want us to be flippant at all. That if you are a pastor or leading an organization, you feel this pinch. It is real. Secular too is real. But again, I'm not so sure it's actually what it means to live in a secular age. I think what it means to live in a secular age is to live in secular 3. I think the real challenge we face is secular 3. Now, like I said, once these arrive, they're always there. So secular 2, you have to face it. But really, I think the head-on wrestling that we have to do is with secular 3. All right, so here's the hard part. What do we mean by secular 3? I should just say, we'll see you after lunch. Because that would be like the real cliffhanger for you to come back. Like, I was gonna leave, but now I got to stick around. But we still have a half hour, so we're going to start. What's that? Next episode. Yes, that's right. That's right. And this is going to happen, but sometimes I tell people when I do this as an all-day thing that we're going to break, and it's going to feel like that. If some of you are old enough to remember when you saw Lord of the Rings in the theater, like the first one, the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, do you remember that? Like it was during Christmas, and you watched it for 3.5 hours. And then the last scene is Frodo turning to his friend and saying, now we're going to take this ring up the hill. The battles are before us. And the credits roll. And you're like, what? I watched 3.5 movies for the movie to start? And now I got to wait 2 years? It's a little bit of what's going to happen in about 20 minutes, just so you're aware that we're going to leave you hanging. But you're lucky because we still have a little bit of time to go. All right, so I've distracted you enough. So what is secular 3? How would I define this? All right, so just to review this again, secular 1 is public-private divide. Secular 2 is fewer and fewer people are going to church. Secular 3 is that all belief becomes contested. It's living in an environment where all belief becomes contested. Or to say it another way that I find a little more helpful, it's to say that all belief becomes fragilized. It becomes fragile. All our forms of belief become fragile. Now, this kind of living in this kind of secular age and this fragilization of belief, it has both a plus and a minus to it. It has both a positive and a negative charge. Now, I don't want you to think of that as pejoratively, like there's a good thing and there's a bad thing. There's a happy thing and there's a sad thing. I want you to think of it like a battery that has both the plus and the minus, and they have to be lined up to get your remote to work. Now, that's the extent of what I understand about electrical engineering, so I'll stop the analogy there. But I do want you to think that there's both a necessary positive and negative element to this. The negative is inside of a secular 3 reality. Transcendence, the idea that there is something bigger and more. That transcendence as an overarching meaning system becomes more and more unbelievable to people. It's hard for it to really order their lives. And if we're honest in this room, it becomes harder for us to. Like, you know, people in your church or in your neighborhood who say things like, I don't know, I'm just going to take a break from God for a while. I'm just taking a break from God for a while. It's a shocking statement. And not just a shocking statement because of our own kind of religious faith propensities. It's just a shocking statement that a human being could do that and think that plausible. Can you imagine someone in Paris in 1215 saying, I'm just going to take a break from God for a while? I mean, everyone would back up as lightning was about to strike, you know? You couldn't do it. But it's very plausible for people to say that in our congregations. And sometimes even our pastoral care is, you should. You should. You know, just, you do you. You should take a break. But even as a pastor, if you're honest, I mean, how often have you gone weeks, months without really thinking about God? I mean, you've written some sermons, you've done some stuff, but really thought about God. That's not, again, to shame anyone. It's just to say this is an interesting social environment we live in. And this is part of secular 3, is that the overarching meaning system of transcendence becomes more and more unbelievable to people. And that isn't even to say it's rejected. It just is hard for it even to make a lot of sense to hold on to. So that's the negative reality. The positive reality, however, is that people deeply, deeply yearn for meaning. They feel a certain thrust to try to find meaning to their lives. They feel like they have to be looking for it and constructing it. This is one of the reasons, it's a larger phenomenology, but one of the reasons why spirituality reoccurs. Because people, and why Wendy, if we said, well, Wendy, we're different than you because we're spiritual people and you're not very spiritual. She'd be, no, I'm very spiritual. Because you need a certain kind of spirituality to help you find meaning. That there's a necessity to kind of look for spirituality as one and maybe a major way for you to find meaning. People are deeply looking for meaning. I hate to admit this to you all, but I was raised by MTV, and so I've watched every Real World, Road Rules Challenge, now just the challenge. I've watched them all. I tell myself that I do it for research purposes. It's not. It's just pure garbage that I love. But they've been doing these as Paramount Plus has come online. They've been doing these reunions from the early Real World seasons. You guys know Real World, right? This is MTV show that started in 90 or 89 or something. If you don't know the Real World, it's a show where they get 7 strangers who are picked to live in a house when things stop getting polite and they start getting real. It's the Real World. That's how the show starts. Come on, that's funny. It is 7 strangers that they pick to live in a house, and it just is crazy debauchery. And it was, if you watch the early seasons, it was just pure debauchery, and it got even worse as seasons went on. But they started to do these 30-year reunions with these people and put it on Paramount Plus to get old people, older middle-aged people like me to watch it, Whatever did happen to Eric? Well, what happened to Eric is he became a spiritual sage. So if you watch the reunion of all these New York ones, the first season, they all came back and they all, almost their first catch-up was how they had all found a spiritual enlightenment. Everyone became spiritual. So, of course, once you hit middle age and you have to find meaning to your life, well, you find some spirituality to do that. I mean, this is a very interesting kind of secular age that we live in, that it creates this space and this necessity to kind of find your own spirituality. Now, it'll be a do-it-yourself spirituality, more than likely, and you'll be able to kind of bricolage, put it together as you want. But there is a necessity that you find a spirituality. But, of course, it has a lot to do with the fact that you have to find meaning. That you really have to find meaning, and you're going to have to find meaning often within yourself, and you're going to need a spirituality to do that. The other part of this is that we're living in a particular time where the competition is intense. The way even our economy is structured is to put people always in competition and always needing to perform. And that constant need to perform and the constant need to compete, well, it becomes a rash. And one of the ways you can help that rash is to put a little ointment of spirituality on it. Makes it go. And so Silicon Valley particularly has been able to be a hyperly competitive place that believes there is no God, but there are all sorts of needs for mindfulness and meditation and a certain form of yoga. And part of it is why? Because the burden of having to bring an investment back to venture capital or just to be a coder and have to code 13 hours a day, one of the ways to help you continue to do more with less is to use spirituality as a way to do that. It's a little more complicated than that, but you see why that arises. So there's both this plus and the minus. Transcendence as an overall meaning system lost, but a deep sense that you are on a process looking for meaning. Now, as we go into Secular 3, I'm really drawing a lot, and some of you are very aware of this, from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who's a Quebecois, Montreal philosopher who wrote this book in 2007 called A Secular Age. And I tell my students that it's the first philosophy book written in the 21st century that I think will be read in the 22nd century. I mean, it's that important of a book, but it's hard. It's 770 pages. It's a perfect book if you happen to have an office where the wind blows your door shut it'll keep your door open all day long. On the windiest day, it will. It is a very, very thick book, and if it falls off your shelf and hits you in the head, you will be concussed. But what will make you really get dizzy is to really get a handle on it, you have to read it 3 times. All right, so that makes you a little nauseous. 770 pages, you got to read this thing 3 times. What will really, really make you dizzy is he only wants to answer one question. One question, and it's actually a minimal question, which he only wants to talk about the West. And his question is, why in the West? If you go back, let's just use big, bold numbers, round numbers. You go back 500 years to 1500. Why was it nearly impossible to not believe in God? We've unpacked that. You go forward to 2000, completely flipped. Relatively short time across Western societies, particularly in continental Europe, in the Scandinavian countries, in the UK, in his own Canada, it's much easier to not believe in God than to believe in God. What happened? 770 pages telling us what happened there. And I've been trying to synthesize that for you in some ways. But what makes it worth reading, a few of you will, and that's a good decision, but what makes it worth reading and why it takes 770 pages is, of course, there's no easy answers. And he works things from multiple angles. And one of the things he says about this kind of secular age, secular 3, is he says this kind of fragilization, it's a two-way fragilization. It's a two-way fragilization. So it works like this. If you're someone who believes, you've believed your whole life, my goodness, you're a pastor of a congregation. He says you just can't help it. You just can't help that at certain points you're going to find yourself fragilized. You're going to have a moment where you think, is this true? Or is this just the family I grew up in? I mean, if I would have grown up in a different family at somewhere else in the world, would I really believe this? Nope, I believe it. It's true. It's true. You go on, you live. And then you have an experience of fragilization again, where you think, is this true? I mean, religion, Christianity, all its claims? Whereas all religion really is false pattern recognition. I mean, is this just an evolutionary trick writ large? Is that all this is? Nope, I believe it. You move in and out of these moments. He's saying there's only a very small percentage of people who can believe and never doubt. And those people we call religious fundamentalists. But everyone else has these moments of fragilization. He thinks that's true. And he's a deep believing Catholic, and he just thinks that's part of the environment we live in. But like I said, it's a two-way fragilization. So it works the other way as well. So let's say you're a young adult. Let's say that you've gone to an elite university. You've now moved to San Diego because you're, working on this adventure company or something, and you're starting a band, and you're working on an app, and this is who you are, and you got this figured out. I mean, you know what religion is. I mean, don't be stupid. Come on, don't be stupid. What religion is a historical reality used by powerful people to keep other people down. That's what religion is. What you believe is that you don't believe. That's the way it goes. And when you die, there's another world. Get over yourself. What happens when you die is like a TV set that's on. It gets unplugged. It just goes blank. That's what happens when you die. Grow up. There's no meaning in the universe. We are so small. Do you know how big the universe is? We are just a meaningless galaxy in a more meaningless solar system on a meaningless little planet in the far, far corner of it, and you think your life matters. What's good news is that there's no meaning in the world. Get over yourself. That's what you believe, is that you don't believe. His point is, you too will have moments where you find that fragilized. Your sister will call you and say, you have to come to your nephew's Christmas concert. You'll go to a Christmas concert, maybe had a couple drinks going into it with work, happy hour at work. You just slide in, you're just trying to keep your sister off your back. You go in, you sit there, and it's a Bach Christmas concert. And all of a sudden, boom, 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 the music plays, and it hits you. And you feel pulled. You feel like something embraces you and pulls you up. And you feel like, oh my gosh, there's something more in the world. There's some purpose. And you find your unbelief fragilized, and you find for a minute that you believe. Or where we know from a lot of statements that where this happens to a lot of people is when they have their first child. No meaning in the world. We're just a small, insignificant universe. There's no purpose at all. That's what you believe. And then you pick that baby up for the first time. And its little hand grabs your finger. And you go, uh-oh. There's got to be something more. Maybe there's something literally reaching for me, but there's something spiritual. There's some kind of purpose beyond this. And you find your meaning. You find your unbelief fragilized. Or you get word. And it's quite sad news that your mother's died. So you fly home to be part of the funeral, to remember your mother. You spend the day, funeral, burial. You spend the night at your cousin's house who lives in town. And you spend that night up remembering your mother. Siblings are there, cousins are there. You talk, you cry, you laugh, you cry some more. You tell stories about your mom. One of the stories you tell is how when she would clean the kitchen when you were in high school, she'd always put on this like 80s song and do this little weird dance while she would sweep up. And it makes you cry harder, but it makes you laugh harder. And on the night goes. You have a very early flight in the morning. You go to bed. You sleep through your alarm. You wake up. You throw your clothes in your suitcase. You get to that rental car. You put the key in the ignition. You back up, and the radio has been left on. Just goes to some local radio station. But as soon as you back up, there it is. That same 80s song. And you find yourself fragilized. Maybe there's a bigger story. Maybe there's something more here. But you do have a choice. You could hear that 80s song and you could go, oh my gosh. Jeffrey Bezos is listening to everything we say anywhere. Unplug the Alexa. Unplug it now. And that's a joke, but it also is the very disposition of what it means to live in this kind of secular age. There's nothing that forces you symbolically or just the kind of currents of the culture and society to say, oh, it is. Behold the work of the Lord. It could be, someone's always listening in. They're really trying to get my ads, So you see, this is what this two-way fragilization means, is that we move in this kind of direction, that we are fragilized if we believe, and we're fragilized in our unbelief to have these moments of belief. And Taylor's point is there's only a small, very small percentage of people who can not believe and never believe. And that small percentage of people are called British New Atheists, but everyone else finds themselves believing. And if you know British New Atheists, that's a funny joke. But for most of us, we're moving in and out of that reality. There's more that we need to tease out of this secular 3, but I've just dropped a lot on you, and we're nearing lunch, so let's debrief this a bit together. So let's how are you making sense of these 3 seculars? Do you think you have a handle on secular 3? Like I said, we have some places we need to go with this after lunch, but I don't want to rush too much. Again, this is 770 pages synthesized for you, and trying really, even more than synthesized, is to link this up with your imagination of ministry and of your own pastoral identity. But we need to let it breathe. This is coming from Quebec, a French society, so you have to let the wine breathe a little bit, to really taste it. So let's breathe in. Let's turn to some people next to us, especially you extroverts, and debrief this for a bit. Let's talk for about 10 or so minutes together, and then we will break for lunch.
Was secular 3 so complicated you couldn't come up with
I'm getting there. I promise you. Thank you very much. There's always this would be me too. It's like, finish the diagram. I'm very type A, so I would be very uncomfortable that there isn't. I promise you, this is my hook to come back after lunch, that you get the rest of the diagram. So thanks for that. All right, we'll come back together. All right, I promise you we'll have more time in the afternoon to debrief this and discuss this. But any insights you want to give the room before we break for lunch? Thoughts that you were thinking in your groups? Yeah, please.
Could you help us understand how, like, the artists of these different eras have served as prophets and tried? So,
Yeah.
Harry Potter versus Narnia.
Uh-huh.
One was a-religious, one is religious, right?
Yeah.
One is Harry Potter versus Narnia. One's good, one's bad. Not to me.
Yeah.
Not to me.
You just said very controversial things there, yeah.
Not to me.
Yeah.
They're both beloved to me. Or I grew up in an era where it was like you would go to a Christian bookstore and it was like, if you like Britney Spears, you'll love Stacey Orico. If you like, you guys know those people? Yeah. And then there was Switchfoot, God forbid, or Creed or POD. And you're like, or Bone Thugs and Harmony had like this one line that said they prayed every day. And so you're like, we can listen to that one song.
Yeah.
And so growing up in this world, there was these artistic, prophetic voices.
Yeah.
But you referenced Notre Dame, you referenced the artists in those early eras led the way culturally. And it feels like now Christian artists, not holistically, but are behind the culture.
Yeah.
And so has there been this I don't even know the proper term, but almost like this remnant of people who have been like, hey, there's a story. Do you see it? And they were the prophets and the artists.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there needs, you need to write a doctoral dissertation on that. Like, I mean, honestly, it's a great question, and there's a lot there. To touch on it, I think you point to something that's really quite interesting, is that we forget this, like the Ninja Turtles, or who they're reflecting as the Renaissance artists. Like, we love Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo. Like, we love those folks, but our glorification of those Renaissance artists is looking at them as modern people back. That at the time, even the Renaissance artists were not very well known as individuals. Like, we love the idea of these, we love the idea of Michelangelo getting super mad at the Pope's guy. And so when he paints in the Sistine Chapel, hell, he puts the representative that didn't like his art as like the face of the devil, And we just love the kind of like crazy artist. But that's not how they thought of it. Even in the Renaissance, like the name that was supposed to be known through the Renaissance was not Michelangelo, Leonardo. It was supposed to be the Medici, the patrons who paid for this. It was supposed to honor their name, and their responsibility was to put beauty in Florence so it would reflect the beauty of God. And there's a lot of ego involved with the Medici, of course. But their idea was Florence must become the most beautiful city because the beauty is to prepare people, or at least to witness to people of the very beauty of God. The artists didn't really matter. I mean, to such an extent that when Leonardo da Vinci is taken into France, the king of France invites him to France to be in his court and to paint, and he dies. This is why today, if you want to go see the Mona Lisa, you have to go to the Louvre, because the Louvre is owned by the French. Why do the French own the Mona Lisa? Because Leonardo, who's a Florentine Italian, died in France in the king's court, and he was only there on the gift of his patron. All the art he would create anyhow was for his patron. It was not for Leonardo's name. It was for the glory of God and the name of the king. So it's Francis, because it was the king's Like for us, it was like, oh, Leonardo's dead. Let's send all his paintings back to his family in Florence. And that's just not how we think about it. What's happened, of course, now is that the referent of the artist is not the divine. The reference is you. You're the great artist. That we look at the great artist and go, man, that person's a genius. Like sometimes we'll say that person's touched by God, but really what we mean is there's something creatively genius about their expression of themselves that draws attention or draws that. So art becomes a very different referent. And we have a certain way that we think of creativity now as a certain kind of spirituality that's embedded in the self. We tell every kid you're creative, but you have to find your creative way of being you. But the greatest way to be, especially a middle-class, upwardly mobile person, is to be like a creative juggernaut. But that is not how anyone before the modern era would have thought about it. If you would have said to a theologian, if you would have said to Bernard of Charvaux, man, Bernard, you are a really creative theologian, he would have been so deeply offended by that. So deeply offended. Because what you would have been saying is he's a heretic. To sort of say that, see, the problem with that church is a very creative church. That's an insult. But almost none of us would hear creativity as an insult. Like if you showed up today and someone's like, well, look at you. Look at you. Aren't you a creative thing? You'd have been like, yeah, damn right. I am. I'm great. That'd make you feel good. But before, particularly this late modern expressivist individual time, that would have been an insult. Now, what do you mean? Even in kind of like agrarian early 20th century, especially if you lived in a rural community, you didn't want to stick out. You didn't want to be the creative one. It really is a post-60s, post-68 reality to really glorify creativity, originality, and to hate conformity. It is in 1950s, Paul Tillich preaches a sermon where he basically says conformity is evil. And one of the reasons they think that, gosh, here we go, is a long story, but conformity, after World War II, a lot of the philosophers and sociologists who started to teach the largest generation, the baby boomers, the largest generation ever to go to college, were exiles from Nazi Germany. And they became very, very clear that German society in the 1930s was utterly conformist, to such a point that it just simply went along with the Nazification of Germany. That rhetoric, that historical reality, they were quite literally, I know we use traumatized as a kind of catchword now, but they were quite traumatized by this. So as Vietnam and other things start to happen, they become very concerned about conformity. And as they even see the movements of the civil rights movement push back and watch the ways that is happening and now being exposed, there's a lot of rhetoric towards being very weary of these kind of totalitarian states that could demand conformity, which was a good word, but it also kind of was taken by there was a rival of a new consumer society. And if you've ever watched Mad Men, the story of Mad Men is an incredibly important point in American history, because as coming out of World War II, there were two absolute nightmares we never wanted to return to. And those were, of course, further economic depression and World War III. And the only way you could make sure those didn't happen is that you had to keep your economy liquid. And so a British economist named Keynes had this economic theory that the Americans particularly took, which was that you needed to make every American family a small stream of spending that would then lead to a raging river of the American economy. And that would keep the depression, that would keep war away. So the Cold War, the first front of the Cold War is fought in economics. Which one of these systems, a capitalist or a socialist system, will do that? So you had to do your duty. If you had fought in the Battle of the Bulge, if you had to do your duty. What was your duty? Well, it's better than the Battle of the Bulge because you had to buy a Buick, you had to move to a suburb, particularly if you were a white GI, you got these privileges to be able to do these things. And it was your duty to keep buying. But the problem was, if you did that for duty, and you got a Buick 2 years ago, why would you need a Buick 3 years? And if you will see those like pictures from that period, like all these American men going to work in the same gray flannel suit. It was just a lot of conformity and duty. Well, if you're working in Madison Avenue and you have to keep this economy liquid, conformity is a bad leverage point to get people to buy. It's a very bad leverage point. It just is really, really hard. And you feel as this kind of budding bohemian, and there's this kind of bohemian sense that is flipped through, you just feel like it's so dull. It's so just dull. Well, all of a sudden these suburban kids of great economic privilege who have been raised in the first ever consumer society start revolting against their parents and against the government in certain ways. And the main way they do it is by being nonconformist. Hair long, loud clothes. And if the marketers, there's a great book by Thomas Frank who writes The Conquest of Cool. And his point is that these Madison Avenue art departments see that and say, that's it. That's the leverage point. You buy not as your duty, you buy as a sense of self-expression. You buy not to fit in, but to stand out. So now you're an artist because of the way you buy your stuff. Now you're the artist. Now you're the creator. So now you can see creativity becomes a kind of form of self-expression, not a reflection of a divine reality. And so the question just becomes, I mean, do you get like kind of crass, like what does really create more beauty? You know, like, I don't know. This is where you see my cards on the table. Like, I don't know. I walk through medieval Italian churches, and I just think this is incredibly beautiful. And the late modern mind just has no impulse to create this, but has all sorts of impulses to create like expressivist ways of being a unique self. So that becomes a big question. Like, can you have Christian forms of art like a medieval point if you don't live under a very strong sense of God speaking and acting and moving and inside that symbolic system? Because then what do you get? You just get consumer forms that are kind of Christian knockoffs of what there's been. But it's also very hard to just put that back together. You know what I mean? It's like a huge system. And so you can't just say like, well, we want to create Christians who can create a whole culture of art. I mean, you can try that, but you're also dealing with a whole structure that doesn't affirm that, you know? So, long answer, great question. You should write a dissertation on it. So, all right, we're going to stop there. You can see I can get long-winded and I can start doing dissertation defenses, which I don't mean to, but here is Derek, and we're ready to eat lunch.
Thank you. Let's express our thanks for Andy.